welcome back to Screenwriters Rewatch. We're continuing our journey through the IMDb Top 250 film list, and in this episode, I'm joined by Fiona. We'll be talking about the 2020 Florence Zelda film, The Father. We have a full length discussion over on our podcast where Fiona and I will decide whether or not it deserves a place in film history and in the script department vaults, which are, well, I can't actually remember. Perhaps I'll try looking in the cupboard under the bath. So welcome back to Screenwriters Rewatch, Fiona. Thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
I'm really well. It's great to be back. It's been quite a few weeks between podcasts, so I'm really excited to be here, and I'm very excited to talk about The Father.
Good. This was a really tough watch for so many reasons for me, but I'm really keen to hear what you think, Fiona.
Yeah, okay. It was a bit of a tough watch for me too, mainly because oh geez, I'm giving the plot away, but anyway, I'll get to why it was tough in the end. But I enjoyed it. I think it was, yeah, a very interesting film. It's a screenplay adaptation of The Father, which is a play by Florian Zeller. So he directed this. He also wrote the original play in 2012, which he received lots of awards for, apparently. And it's really interesting because it feels like, to me, when I watched it, I could really feel like it was a theatre piece, just in the way the scenes were set, and just sort of there was some qualities about it that felt really theatrical, which we'll probably dig into a little bit later. And apparently it was inspired by his personal experience with dementia, and interesting for me to watch, as my mother had dementia, and I lost my mom through dementia. So it was a very sort of triggering subject in a way for me, but equally, it wasn't disturbing. I actually was a bit worried that I was not going to enjoy it, or it would be too hard to watch, but actually it probably just created more of a sense of empathy towards the experience of my mother and anybody who's gone through, lived with dementia. Um, so apparently, in adapting the screenplay, Zeller collaborated with Christopher Hampton, who wrote Dangerous Liaisons and Atonement. And apparently, that combination of screenwriting and playwriting is how the sort of piece came together. And I guess, from a genre point of view, I felt that it was, and I'd be interesting to see what your thoughts are, Helen, whether you agreed. I felt that it was a sort of a psychological drama. It was really interestingly set up in that, and I read nothing about it before I watched it. I just watched it completely blind, just to really sort of immerse myself in the story. And for well, certainly a big chunk of the beginning of the film, I wasn't quite sure what was happening. Obviously, that was a deliberate technique, which we'll talk about. But there was a question around whether this was this sort of fragmented nature of the narrative, all the way through. You think, okay, well, is this the point of the protagonist, which is the Anthony character, the Anthony Hopkins, or is there something sinister going on? You do question for a little while into the film about whether is this a sort of an older person who's being taken advantage of by their relatives around them. It does really make you think, oh, is this going to spin off into something really dark, some type of thriller? But actually, it pulls back at a certain point, and you realize that this is the experience of our protagonist, and this is his life, and the fragmentation is around depicts the loss of memory and cognition of him, and makes us experience from that first person point of view that disorientation and that confusion that he felt, which was really quite a powerful device, I thought, from a sort of cinematography point of view, and a screenwriting point of view. So we get these multiple versions of reality all blurred, and we aren't quite sure what's what, and we have to slowly piece it together in both a timeline point of view, which was really tricky at some points, but also about what was actually his experience and what was the experience of those around him. So in terms of things like themes, it covered a couple of really interesting themes, I thought, around identity mostly, which I really liked the fact that it really, there's a line at the end where Hopkins says, I'm losing all my leaves, because there's a beautiful view of trees outside his window in the home that he ends up in. And it's a really abstract metaphor, but when you're in that moment with him, you really understand what he means and how he feels about this loss of identity. And it really makes you think about the experience of someone with dementia. And when is that point where you realize you're not you realize you're losing it, essentially. And it's so I thought that was a really kind of particularly powerful moment. But yeah, the idea of identity and loss, I thought it was interesting the way that the film looked at the B characters, particularly the daughter character, and actually because there was some interesting reflections of her sense of identity and her sense of self and her life, actually, which I felt was definitely one of the kind of key points that they were trying to bring across, was not only the experience of the person with dementia, but also the sort of flow-on effects to the family. Obviously, they looked at things like perception and reality. It also looked at things like family caregiving and the relationships, and the difficult relationships and the difficulty, I think, that sometimes carers have to go through in that process. So lots of things that really made us as viewers more empathetic towards the protagonist. Absolutely. Things I liked about it, I thought the approach was really unique. It had a very innovative narrative structure. There's some risks with that around how able you are to keep the audience on board with you for the whole way, and are the audience indeed on board, or are they utterly confused? I suspect maybe a minority of people would just be kind of confused about it. But I think in general, it's a really innovative approach to presenting a narrative. I thought it was a very powerful approach, putting us in the protagonist's seat, having us sort of experience that firsthand idea of loss of cognition and loss of memory. And I liked the idea. I thought it was quite thought-provoking in some of the themes that it brought up about caregiving and the flow-on effects to the family around you. In terms of weaknesses, I just felt that the supporting characters were a little bit underdeveloped, and I think that may have been deliberate around the fact that this was very much the point of view of the protagonist, and maybe the point was we weren't really supposed to know too much about the supporting characters. But I felt particularly the character Anne, who is played by Olivia Colman, I really wanted to know more about her kind of point of view, because there were some points in the narrative where the timeline goes a bit askew, and it made me then wonder about what was the truth of the Anne character, and I didn't really get enough to grab onto to really get a sense of her. It was just a personal thing, probably. But and so therefore the kind of those character arcs were a little bit patchy as well, but again, by nature of the fact that the whole narrative is deliberately fragmented, so it may have been just that. But I think on the whole, it was a really emotionally gripping film. It was a really smart and unique approach to try and make us feel like we're in the shoes of that main character. And I thought, yeah, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it didn't move me hugely, though. That is one point. It didn't really grip me completely, and I thought that actually, as I said, having that personal response to it, I thought it actually might, but it didn't. And I don't know why. Maybe that's because if you go through that personally, you're kind of a bit more hardened to it to watch it. I don't know. Maybe it's that, but that was the only thing that I was, it didn't make me cry, for example. It didn't move me that much. So that was interesting. But that, as I said, that may be more about me than the film itself or the screenplay. But yeah, definitely a fascinating watch. And yeah, looking forward to chatting more with you, Helen, into your thoughts about the film.
Yeah, I think we've got quite a few similar threads there, and roles, identity, that sort of abandonment is a huge part of this. And I've got quite a lot to say on the timeline. And I do think, even though neither of us are very familiar with the play and the theatrical setup, um, I feel like it should be explored, because translation from stage to film is something that it was quite tricky. So yeah, we'll unpack that in our full length discussion over on our podcast. So if you want to join us, just search for the Script Department wherever you get your podcasts, or you can find the link in the video description below, and we'll see you over there.